Hello everyone, Ron here, and I am here with something a little bit different, a video that I'm going to put up on both channels. This is a bumped up request from Cleo. Thank you very much, Cleo. And it is, what if Canada joined the European Union? First of all, if you're watching on the music station, you can check in the description to see how to bump up your request and get it a lot quicker. Uh, But this has a bit of a educational value. Hopefully, we're going to see what the video is all about. I haven't watched the video yet, but Cleo asked me what my opinion was on just the topic. What if Canada joined the European Union? And truthfully, I hadn't really thought about us joining the European Union. I have thought about Canada doing more trade with other countries. We do have agreements with many, many countries, including free trade agreements with many of them. Uh, and I've always thought, for decades, I've thought we should be doing more trade with other countries because that old saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket. So every now and again, there's an issue with the United States over softwood lumber, over dairy products, etc. And I always thought, why are we not doing more trade with other countries? Of course, doing trade with the United States is easy generally because geographically we're very close. Transporting things down to the United States is a lot easier than trying to get over to Europe or Asia. But I still thought that we should do that. Joining the European Union, I don't even know if that's possible. Maybe they'll explain in this video. We shall see. I'm not sure if it's necessary either. I'm not sure if Canadians would want that or not. I have no idea. I haven't heard anyone talk about it, to be honest. Um, but I have heard a lot of Canadians talk about doing more trade outside of the United States and, of course, boycotting United States products right now because of what Trump has done and continues to do. But he is now tariffing many, many countries around the world, including countries that don't have trade with the United States and countries that don't even have people on them, or places, islands, whatever, that don't have people. So that's bizarre. Uh, so I don't know about that. I do think we should have more interprovincial trade in Canada. So taking those barriers down is a good idea, and some of the Canadian politicians are talking about that. Hopefully that they do that. I also have thought that for a long, long time. I can't remember when it first came up. And I thought, well, why aren't we trading between provinces a lot more? It seems to make sense to me. Of course, again, it is easier, for example, for British Columbia to trade with the United States because it's much closer just moving south than to try to get all the way over to Ontario where I am, or over to the East Coast is even further. So, east to west is a longer distance. So geographically, I understand it. But in other ways, I think it does make sense. So anyway, that's my 2 cents worth so far. We'll see what this video says and whether I agree with them or disagree. Probably it's going to be mixed. I don't know. We'll see. And you can let me know. What do you think? Should we join the European Union? I don't know if we need to join in or whether we can just have good trade agreements with other countries. We do have, or we did have, a trade agreement with the United States that had been beneficial to the United States. It's been beneficial to Canada. And of course, Mexico was also in that trade agreement. In theory, still is. But of course, Trump has thrown a wrench into all of that. So, yeah, we'll see. We'll see moving forward. All right, let's have a listen to what if Canada join the European Union.
If you look at a map, they drew an artificial line right through it between Canada and the U.S. Just a straight artificial line. Somebody did it a long time ago.
It's not straight.
Troubles with the United States have led to suggestions that Canada could become the European Union's 28th member. Canada isn't even in Europe, you say. But if you look at it from this angle, well, okay, Canada still isn't in Europe, but it also isn't as disconnected from the continent as standard maps make it seem. Consider that a recent poll suggested more Canadians support the idea of joining the EU than oppose. Obviously not conclusive, but it speaks to openness to unprecedented ideas in unprecedented times. So what challenges would Canada face joining the EU in increasing order of difficulty?
European-ish?
If Canada joined the European Union, it would immediately become the fifth largest member by population, 39 million. Currently, Germany is the EU member with the most people, 84 million, about double Canada's population. France is currently the largest by area, 540,000 square kilometers or 210,000 square miles. If Canada joined, it would be far and away the largest EU country by area, roughly 10 million square kilometers or 3.8 million square miles. In fact, Canada is over double the size of the current European Union, meaning that adding Canada as 28th member would triple the geographic area of the European Union. But come on, Canada is not on the European continent, so how in the world could it be part of the European Union? The so-called Copenhagen criteria for EU enlargement has other prerequisites to joining the EU, such as democratic institutions.
So I just turned the CC on. I didn't think of it before. I'm understanding him without any issue. But many of my viewers like to have the CC on. If it keeps working, it looks like it's going to work. I'll leave it on. If not, I'll turn it off.
Rule of law, a functioning market economy, the willingness and ability to comply with EU law. You'll notice being on the European continent is not a formal requirement to join. Article 49 of the Treaty on the EU says being a, quote, European state is a requirement, but the term European state is left undefined. Part of the process of negotiating accession is determining if a state is sufficiently European. So might Canada qualify in a stretched definition of a European state based on heritage and its head of state? We'll get back to that. But let's not just pass over the broad geography here because, yeah, most of the EU's countries are indeed on the continent and share a land border. Ireland, Cyprus, and Malta are EU members that don't share a land border with another EU country, but nonetheless, their relative proximity allows ease of trade and movement of people. If, just for the sake of argument, New Zealand were to consider joining the European Union, the challenge of being so very far away would surely complicate that conversation, even if we consider New Zealand's European links. And that's especially true due to the geographic nature of defense policy, which we'll get to. One way to overcome the geographic issue for Canada is to simply turn the
Sorry, there are advertisements, so I'll have to edit those out.
True due to the geographic nature of defense policy, which we'll get to. One way to overcome the geographic issue for Canada is to simply turn the globe and realize that Canada isn't that far away. Cape Columbia, Canada's northernmost point, is only 2,400 kilometers away from Norgum, Finland, 1,500-ish miles. That's half the distance between New York and California. The distance between St. John's, Canada and Dublin is about the same as between Dublin and Cyprus. You can fly from Helsinki, Finland to Lisbon, Portugal within the EU in about 4.5 hours. And similarly, you can go from Montreal to Lisbon in 6.5 hours. It's different, but nothing crazy. Between Canada and the European Union are also Iceland, Greenland, the United Kingdom, Norway. While not EU member states, they are all closely linked to the EU. Take all these places in EU orbit and add Canada, and it starts to look like a genuinely formidable bloc. With a tripled territory, there would be a lot more land and sea to defend. On the other hand, the EU and Canada would become unified players in the Arctic at a crucial moment. So that's one piece here. Canada joining the EU is a bit of a stretch geographically, but let's return to the more challenging direct question. Could Canada qualify under Article 49 as a European state? Canada is right above the United States, and it feels like it. Canadian English and American English are hard to distinguish, and a lot of Canadian culture is based on finding ways to distinguish from America because the similarities can be so overwhelming. So yeah, at first glance, Canada joining the EU is about as odd as the United States joining the EU. Oceans and cultures divide, but Canada is a country with European roots, Western European to be specific. Now, I don't want to step into a big debate about colonialism, but suffice it to say that the British and French empires left their marks on Canada in ways that remain culturally and politically relevant, arguably more relevant than the legacy of those empires in the United States. And thus, Canada is a country that could plausibly join the EU and fit right in culturally. In Quebec, people tend to identify as Canadian, but also as a distinct Quebecois with deep French ties. If you were dropped in Quebec City or Montreal, you'd be forgiven for thinking you were in Europe. And French is one of the official languages of Canada, required for civil servants. French, by the way, is one of the two most prominent languages in the EU's bureaucracy. The other is English. Of course, most Canadians speak English thanks to British colonialism. But it's not just cultural, it's also political. Over the years, most of Canada has proudly demanded to keep the British monarch as head of state, even when becoming a dominion in the late 1800s. Contrast that with the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, where the main sticking point for Irish Republicans was revulsion at keeping the
Not sure we demanded to keep it, but yeah, a lot of people like to keep the monarchy. I don't know right now what the stats are on that. A lot of people felt that when the Queen of England died, maybe that should be it for at least Canada and the monarchy. But I think now that King Charles is in, I don't know that I haven't. I'm not out there enough talking to everybody, I guess, to know for sure. But it seems to have quieted down. I haven't heard a lot of complaints. So.
of England as their head of state. It caused the Irish Civil War. Canada hasn't been like that. The Governor General still represents the British monarch's interests in Canada, albeit ceremonially, and Canada has a parliament and prime minister, modeled off the Westminster system. Now, these two European components, French Canada and Anglo Canada, don't always see eye to eye. For example, French Canada was not universally enthused when Canada joined World Wars I and II alongside the UK, but still, Canada joined World Wars I and II long before the United States because of their deep ties to the UK and Europe. In fact, in World War I, Canada was automatically joined in the war when the UK declared. To hit home this point, I asked my friend Elise for a little help. I met her when I was working at the German embassy, and she was a French diplomat here in DC. Her thesis was coincidentally about Canada and the Great Wars in Europe.
So my question to you is, admitting that it is a bit of a stretch, because of Canada's roots in the British and French Empire, because of the way they participated in World War I and II, is there an argument to be made that Canada is more European than it first appears?
Well, it does have a more connected history to Europe that America can have, because America somehow, like in his identity, national building story is all about breaking the chains with Europe, where Canadians until very recently, and I think still nowadays, if you have a visit of the royals, there's a strong feeling. Actually, on the coins in Canada, you can still have the Queen and some.
Yeah, sorry, the CC, I don't know, it's turned on still, but it was coming up. Now it's not coming up. I turned it off and on again, but it doesn't seem to work. I did see a flash of the Canadian money, and so I pulled my wallet out, and yes, there's my 20 with the Queen on still. Still got the Queen on. I don't know when the King is coming, but
the symbolism. So there is a strong history with that. Now, Canada has only one border, and that's still a pretty big difference with any European country. But I like your comparison, and I think in many ways Canada could be the Switzerland of North America.
So the bottom line is that for history, for culture, for blood, Canada isn't as far from a European state as you'd initially think. Sure, it's a stretch, but there's a lot of subtlety here, and those deciding an application would get to engage with that subtlety because this would be legally unprecedented. I mentioned the UK several times. You'll probably already have thought, well, the UK left the European Union, so doesn't that cancel out one of Canada's European ties? To that I say, meh. The bottom line is that
meh. Yeah, it kind of takes the Queen out of the equation as well there, or the King at this point.
despite the fact that Canada joining the EU seems at first to be quite random. It's not, as we've seen, neither geographically nor culturally. But now things get even more complicated. Canada potentially joining the EU cannot be truly understood without addressing the sticky issue of defense. Neither
Another ad.
geographically nor culturally. But now things get even more complicated. Canada potentially joining the EU cannot be truly understood without addressing the sticky issue of defense. There's broad overlap between members of the European Union and members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a defense alliance founded in 1949 and traditionally led by the United States. In fact, 23 of the EU's 27 member states are also in NATO. But of course, NATO and the European Union are not the same thing. There are members of the EU that are not NATO, and there are members of NATO that are not in the EU. For example, Canada is in NATO, but not in the EU. So what would it mean for Canada to join the European Union now as a pre-existing member of NATO? Well, nothing. Sort of. Defense treaties as they exist today aren't the problem. Canada is in NATO, as are many European member states. If Canada joined the European Union, it would simply be another member in both institutions. The complication comes from growing US skepticism of the NATO alliance. What if the US formally leaves the NATO alliance? Or even, as things stand, what if a NATO country is attacked and the Commander-in-Chief of the United States orders the military to ignore any invocation of Article 5 for mutual defense? Because President President Trump, Vice President Vance, and the Secretary of Defense have left lots of open questions in the room about the U.S. fulfilling its treaty obligations. The EU has recently voted to empower member states to spend additional hundreds of billions on their own defense. Large European countries like Germany and France no longer only speak about meeting 2% of GDP for defense spending, as is expected for NATO, but as the head of NATO put it, considerably more than 3%, which some countries like Poland are already exceeding. It leads to a larger question for the European Union, one that I remember being batted around during my time at an EU member embassy here in Washington. Given the unprecedented threats from Russia.
Yes, exactly. Not a surprise that Poland is putting more money into their defense because of this guy. So I was just about to say, before he popped up even, I was about to say that. Yes, under different pressures, money moves in different ways. So, yeah.
Messages from Trump should the EU have its own military. Not just the German military or the Dutch military or the Estonian military, but a single entity controlled by Brussels. French President Emmanuel Macron called for such a true European army back in 2018 and has recently floated the idea of extending France's nuclear deterrent to its European allies. Which brings us to Canada. If Canada were to join the EU, it would need to make a judgment call about the direction European defense is headed. If the EU maneuvers towards a joint defense strategy or joint defense forces, Canada would presumably be part. Might some of Canada's armed forces one day be under the umbrella of Brussels? And how does Canada feel about that? Admittedly, it's speculation on speculation, but decisions would need to be made. In exchange for being part of European defense, Canada would receive the same, which until recently sounded far-fetched and unnecessary, but President Trump said in February 2025 that he wasn't happy with the US-Canadian treaty on borders. And of course, he's constantly insisted that Canada should become the 51st state. Nearly impossible to distinguish below.
He seems to have backed off the 51st state comments for the moment under Prime Minister Carney. However, I think that's a bit of a game as well, because I think he's trying to affect the elections here in Canada. I won't get too far into that, but I'm pretty sure he's trying to put his thumb on the scale there. So we'll see moving forward whether this comment comes back. But Europe's been supporting Canada in many ways, even before all the Trump tariffs went on to European countries and almost every country in the world. They were when Trump was attacking Canada economically and vocally, calling it the 51st state and calling our prime minister, governor, etc. There were people from Europe. I was getting comments that they were boycotting the U.S. As I say, even before the tariffs went on them. So, yeah, and I think in terms of military attacks or problems, I think Canada has done and would support Europe, and I think Europe has done, and well, we haven't really been in a war over here, but I think they would probably anyways. So, too complicated, above my pay grade as far as all of the different organizations and what that would imply. I don't know.
And trolling from legitimate threats, but here we are. So when I was writing the script, I had a hard time determining if these defense questions were trickier than the economic questions. But as of writing, these defense issues are mostly speculative. Meanwhile, the most complicated piece of the puzzle is the very real trade war playing out between the US, Canada, Europe, and the rest of the world. The US trade war and renegotiations of USMCA are the most trade war playing out between the US, Canada, Europe, and the rest of the world. The US trade war and renegotiations of USMCA are the most pressing reasons Canada may consider the heretofore unconsidered idea of joining the European Union. If the economic relationship enjoyed between the US and Canada hits the rocks any harder, Canada will likely want new deals with reliable trading partners. The same goes in reverse for the European Union, as news of American tariffs move faster than headlines can keep up. Of course, if Canada were to join the EU, it would bring its $2.2 trillion economy with it, and by joining it would become the fourth largest economy by gross domestic product. The EU as a bloc is already Canada's third largest trading partner. Bring Canada into the European Union, make them part of the single market for goods and services, exchange free movement of people, the EU may soon rank even higher. There's a lot of assumptions there. First, that Canada joining the EU wouldn't affect trade with the UK, another large Canadian trading partner, which has, of course, left the EU. Second, because beginning accession negotiations to the European Union requires unanimous support from all 27 member states, Canada would need to hope none of its exports were threatening to domestic European firms that could then lean on their home governments to block Canada's accession. For example, a 2017 free trade agreement between Canada and the EU has yet to be fully implemented all these years later because 10 EU countries refused to ratify it. The entire EU would have to be serious about having Canada. But these economic details seem minor compared to this. As of now, about 77% of Canadian exports head to the United States. The Canadian government calls it, quote, the most extensive trading relationship. We are each other's largest trading partners. Canada and the US are part of USMCA, formerly NAFTA, a free trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Even if the Trump administration unilaterally sabotages the USMCA with tariffs, it would still be incredibly difficult for Canada to replace the volume of its free trade from the United States to Europe. Nonetheless, EU and Canadian officials have pledged to have each other's backs as Trump's trade war intensifies. And Canada has aimed to increase its non-US exports by 50%, according to Reuters, and a lot of that would be the European Union. In the meantime, there are initial murmurs of a European movement in Canada, and writers from the BBC and CBC and Economist have indulged the idea, like I'm now doing. Europe needs space and resources, read an Economist headline. Canada needs people. Let's deal. Some minor officials chimed in to endorse the conversation, and Germany's prominent former foreign minister, Sigmar Gabriel, said that the EU should indeed invite Canada to join. When news of that poll I mentioned, showing 44% of respondents thought Canada should join the EU, a European Commission spokesperson said the EU was honored, though she said she wouldn't comment further. On that note, is Canada joining the EU realistic or just wild speculation? I thought about that a lot, and part of the reason I decided to go ahead and write this is because the realm of possibilities has expanded in recent months. The world is realigning, and fast. Something unthinkable. Canada joining the EU, perhaps literally not even having been conceived until recently. It's now out there as something people are talking about. That said, realignment with Europe is more likely than literally joining. It's not likely, at least not a formal joining of Canada becoming the 28th member of the European Union. But what is more realistic, almost guaranteed by the behavior of the United States, is closer alignment between Canada and the EU. Depending on how much the trade war and other disputes escalate, perhaps a partnership of a depth impossible in other circumstances. I've placed the full interview with my friend Elise on Nebula and Substack. I'll be real, I quit my job and I could use some support in this moment. So if you find my content valuable and you're able, head on over to Patreon or Substack and become a paid subscriber. You'll get some personal access to me, some exclusive content, and of course, my undying gratitude. Heads held high. Happy Warriors. Later, y'all.
I was afraid of that. I was trying to get to the end so he could say his last piece there, and of course another ad popped up. So I have edited out the ads because YouTube will be adding more ads, so we don't need ads on top of ads on top of ads. Anyway, yes, I think kudos to him for trying to sort of support the idea of Canada joining the EU throughout most of the video, but I agree more with what he says here at the end is more likely that we have a closer alignment rather than actually formally joining the EU. I think that's more likely. I also think that it's more likely that trade between other continents and countries will change if this trade war continues, because again, it's not just between Canada and the United States and Mexico anymore. It's he's decided that he's going to attack the world, and he's kind of being an isolationist for the United States, in my opinion, which is, again, in my opinion, a huge mistake. It's been tried a little bit before. It's failed miserably before. So we'll see what happens. But I think that there could be different agreements and alignments of other countries and continents as well as Canada. So yeah, that I don't have any problem with that. I think we probably should have done that a long time ago. Not to stop doing trade with the United States. It still makes perfect sense for us to do trade with them. And I do think that once this Orange administration is over, and it will be. It will change again. Things can go maybe not back to normal completely. I think there might be some permanent changes coming, but certainly it still makes perfect sense for us to do a lot of trade with the United States and them to do trade with us because of the very long border, um, very relatively open border and friendly relations. Many Canadians have friends and relatives on the American side. Many Americans obviously have friends and relatives on the Canadian side. And and that's not even including Mexico, which of course you have the same situation on that border. It's a different border, and there are different problems and issues, but nevertheless, there are people from both sides and have been for a long, long time. And I think that we can probably get back to a little bit more normal trade eventually. Maybe not during this administration. It could be, and so what, we got 3.5 or a little more years to go with this one before he tries to get in again. But life moves on, and things change, and things will change for this administration, whether they like it or not. That's just life. We're human, and things will change in the long term. Um, I don't know what to say. What if Canada joined the EU? I don't think that's going to happen, to be honest. I actually also think a lot of businesses and other countries will be trying to make a deal with the Trump administration, trying to make things better, trying to mitigate the problems, even directly with the United States if they can. But if they can't, also a lot will be holding on, which isn't great, but they'll be holding on, waiting for this administration to end. Because moving all of your plants and all of your manufacturing into the United States doesn't seem like a great plan. It's not for them either. First, you need the land, you need all the buildings, you need all the staffing, and they're deporting people. So where are you getting these people from? They'll have to be paid at American rates and benefits, and so all your prices in the States are going to go up regardless of whether it's going up because of tariffs and counter tariffs or whether it's going up because you're trying to do everything in the States. And by the way, a lot of those manufacturing jobs are not gone because of other countries. Some of them are, but because of automation and other things that are changing. Things change. You need to move with the times and not go back to the 1890s and the 1910s, etc., and the 1929, 30 era, and push yourself and the rest of the world into recession, stagflation, depression, whatever. So let's hope that there is a change sooner rather than later. Um, at the time of this recording, there were just recently some protests, many of them, and some of them major in the United States, hands off, and around the world too. I saw a video of one in France, and I think there were other countries as well. So maybe the tide will turn at some point, even before the end of the administration. Canada should make as many positive relations as they can with other countries in terms of trade, but also in terms of social connections and things. I've always thought that was a great idea for any country to do. I think much more positive to or I should say much more profitable, if you like, to just look at money, to have a positive relationship rather than a negative one. So instead of beating people with a stick and trying to force them to bow down, get on their knees, and I could be rude here, but I won't, kiss your ring, I'll say. I think there's much better ways that will work better in the long term for all countries. So yeah, let's be friendly. Let's try to get along. Let's try to find uh, trade agreements and other agreements that make it positive for both of our countries, or all of our countries, I should say, because the world is intertwined here. So that's my 2 cents worth. I could go on and on and on, but I won't. Thank you very much for this, Cleo. I am putting this video up on both channels, so check in the description. There'll be slightly different things depending which channel you're watching on, blah, blah, blah. If you don't mind, hit that subscribe button. It does help either channel very, very much. Also, welcome your comments and also any suggestions for future videos are also welcome. Apart from that, have a beautiful day. It is Ron. Bye bye for now.